So we're going to move right along and continue with chapter 9 of Mark. I think this is session 35. And after chapter 9, I think we'll get into a real meat of the gospel, especially because I did, my doctoral work on the temple cleansing, so-called, chapter 11, etc. And then the rest of it is really the trial and passion of Jesus is quite something. So it would be, I think, interesting. We saw the transfiguration. We discussed it to some extent. And then in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is telling them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. And they don't understand what this rising from the dead is, which I guess they don't know about Daniel 12, where it talks about at least some of the dead rising for judgment. So in any case, I think this would be in line with what we were saying, that this transfiguration sort of smacks of a resurrection type event, and that even though they saw Jesus transfigured, shining white, etc., they don't understand, and they're not supposed to tell anybody until Jesus rises from the dead. And then, sort of like speaking of things that are going to happen, why do these scribes say that Elijah must come first? The scribes being, learned scholars, probably many Pharisees, etc. And so the expectation that Elijah comes before the Messiah comes is still current in Judaism. The famous place at the Passover Seder left for Elijah. And Elijah, I have an actual little paper, I think, on Elijah on my website, was this elusive prophet that we don't know his genealogy, and he disappeared from one place to the other and finally disappeared by being taken up in a chariot of fire, etc., in the beginning of Second Kings. So he and Enoch are the only two people in the Old Testament who don't really die, or are said to not die, but to be assumed or taken up into heaven. I'm looking. I'm going to look for the Second Kings passage there, and in fact, Elijah is taken up into heaven. And so when the prophets are ended with the 12th book, which is the book of Malachi, the law and the prophets end with a reference to the beginning and end of Revelation, by mentioning the law of Moses, my servant, and behold, I send you the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord. So that this prophet, who really didn't die and was taken up to heaven, is expected to come back. The scholar that I've mentioned several times, Harmut Stegemann, Stegemann, if I have it right, I don't think it's two G's, has a very interesting idea that John the Baptist is baptizing on the other side of the Jordan. That's not an idea that comes from him. It's said twice in the Gospel of John that he was on the other side of the Jordan. In John 1:28 and then in 10:40, and there's even a Lucan variant that talks about Perea, which would be the other side of the Jordan. So that if you look at the account in 2 Kings 2, Elijah and Elisha or Elisha have actually crossed to the other side of the Jordan. And it would be very interesting to, as Stegeman says, to think that John the Baptist, in the person of it or role of Elijah, precursor of the Messiah, is taking up his activity right in the place where Elijah was taken up. And so that is interesting. In the Catholic Bible, we have the book of Ecclesiastes or Ben Sirah, and there it talks about the return of Elijah. Also, of course, this would be a book, about 150 years before Christ or so, after Malachi, which is probably 450 before Christ. And you have this idea in Greek, katastesa, it says here, to reestablish. In the Greek version of the end of Malachi, the role of Elijah is to apokatastase, to sort of restore all things. That's what is sort of alluded to in Luke when he introduces John the Baptist in chapter 1. At the birth of John the Baptist, Luke is saying that he will go before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the children to the fathers, etc. So you have this idea of Elijah sort of preparing the way for the Messiah to sort of predispose the people adequately for the coming of the visitation of God, which even in John the Baptist is sort of associated with fire and judgment and the axe being laid to the root. Jesus comes with a different approach, a different style, and he doesn't fast, etc. And you have this kind of this similarity, which is where you get the idea that John the Baptist sent disciples to ask Jesus, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we wait for another?" And of course, in the Gospel of John, you even have simultaneous baptism between Jesus and John the Baptist, or then it says, well, not really Jesus, but his disciples were baptizing. So you have a lot of mysterious things going on with this. But in the Gospel of Mark, you do have this as not as complete an account as in Matthew, for example, but when the disciples asked Jesus, "Isn't Elijah supposed to come first?" Jesus says to them, Elijah does come first to restore all things. And it's also written that the Son of Man should suffer and be treated with contempt. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did with him as they pleased. And so it's left a little bit not explicit, but in the Matthew version in chapter 17, the gloss or the addition, the redaction says, "Then the disciples understood that he was referring to John the Baptist." So that in Matthew 17:13, so that, even in Matthew 11, Jesus in 11:14 in Matthew says, and if you want to accept it, he is Elijah, the one who was to come. So, and others, Stegeman, I think, especially, have considered Malachi 3 John the Baptist's vocation narrative. Malachi 3 begins with really an anonymous messenger or angel. Malachi means that, my angel or messenger. And then he's identified with Elijah at the end of the book, perhaps an addition to that book. So, nevertheless, you have here this tradition of John the Baptist fulfilling the expected Jewish role of Elijah. Of course, on the cross, the Jews, the Jewish crowd, which, Mark is writing about, think that when Jesus says, Eloi, 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 lama sabachthani, that he's calling on Elijah, which in Mark, if this is in Aramaic, and I know some scholars doubt whether this is really Aramaic, but I think normally it's considered to be in Aramaic in Mark and in Hebrew in Matthew, according to Psalm 22. In Aramaic, it would be very difficult to confuse, Eli with Eliah, Eliyahu maybe, Eliah, Eliah. In Hebrew, it's much easier to confuse calling on my God Eli with Eliah or maybe Eliyahu. But in Mark, to confuse the Aramaic Eloi, Eloi, or Elahi, Elahi, it would be very difficult. So this is obviously a way of saying they really are out of it. They think that Elijah's still supposed to come, and he's already come, and they don't know this, and they don't even understand what Jesus is saying on the cross, etc. So I think you have some of those elements there. So anyway, Elijah is an extremely important prophet. And of course, we saw in the Transfiguration, he's named first before Moses. Then you have this sort of interesting episode of my Jerusalem Bible calls it an epileptic demoniac, someone possessed, and everybody. There's a big argument going on, and Jesus, reproaches his disciples for not being able to cast him out, and finally Jesus does cast him out. It's a very earthy, another one of these earthy episodes, with this very interesting line that we use sometimes in spirituality. Jesus responds to the Father, who says, if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. Then the Father very humbly says, I believe, help my unbelief. And so you have, maybe a gradual faith or a weak faith that needs to be strengthened. And then finally, you have the casting out. And the disciples ask Jesus privately, something that often happens in Mark, why couldn't we cast it out? And Jesus responds that this type, a special type of demon cannot be cast out except through prayer, which one would assume it goes without saying. Of course, some manuscripts add and fasting, so that's where you get, just like the kingdom, the glory, and the power are yours now and forever. Those are additions that are quite apropos. They may not be part of the original text, but they are still very helpful spiritually. And then I'm just going to finish with this, the second announcement of the Passion, according to my Bible here, the Son of Man. I count 7 different Passion predictions using Son of Man, going to be delivered, and they will kill him, and they will He will rise again on the third day, but they did not understand. And I want to emphasize again, we'll probably have to get back to the Son of Man a lot more later. But the Son of Man is not a euphemism for a humble human being. The Son of Man is right from Daniel 7, plenipotentiary. Again, Daniel Boyarin, the Jewish Gospels, covers that thoroughly. But Jesus is the one that connects that dot that no one else had connected, that the Messiah, chosen one, Son of Man, all combined as an all-encompassing Redeemer figure, must suffer. And that's what no one really got. And we'll have to stop there.